we're seeing through what Rodney and Truphone are doing, and what through Peter's the moving really to the omnichannel and digital world. It's completely changed, and there are some real kind of new ways of thinking. Rodney, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. Can you only do what you do because you are so small? Is my first question.
I can give you the easy answer, no. Actually, it's a set of practices that can be trained. The way I look at it, there's a model that you need to use. Your service is dependent upon your people. Therefore, who you recruit is critical. So you need to find like-minded people with values that sort of are similar to the organisation. Then you need to have a very good induction and training method that can bring people up to speed. And actually the first 2 days of any of our training is cultural alignment and behavioural alignment. Then you need some management practices. So you need exceptionally good managers that are able to maintain what is trained and developed, and obviously the principles by which you manage by. And that really drives the levels of engagement and therefore the behaviours of the various service personnel. And all of that is absolutely scalable. I've actually delivered this now for Truphone, and that was in a startup scenario. However, prior to that, I was with Lebara, implemented it with 300 people there, and we won about 13 awards for the service that we were delivering there, including Best in Europe. Prior to that, I was with Scottish and Southern Energy, which I saw their logo up there, right. Interesting. Yes. And we applied it to 5,000 staff there to some good success, and they became Best in Industry at service. And actually, we were in the process of taking that to 20,000 people in Scottish and Southern.
Okay. Because I guess we were talking about in the break about sort of telcos traditionally engineering people, staff full of engineers. I can imagine them seeing some of what you were talking about, rolling their eyes and saying, here it comes again. And I think it just kind of highlights to me, like, to get this right, it does really need a cultural change at the top. Can you sort of, you mentioned culture a few times in your piece. Can you sort of just sort of maybe expand on that a little bit, and then the importance of that?
So this really became prevalent to me at Scottish and Southern, actually. The only way, let's go. What I found was we did a lot of research on how we should improve our service organisation. I went to visit some of the experienced leaders in the world, so Disney, Ritz-Carlton, a little bank called Umpqua Bank, which is absolutely fantastic, Starbucks, John Lewis, Hollister, all of those places. And I had the opportunity to go and interview the directors of these organisations. And from that, we distilled down what are the key things that we're seeing that are common across these businesses. And we were able to see some patterns, and we started applying some of those patterns in Scottish and Southern. And to prove, I mean, we came back, and you're right, it's a very engineering culture, especially in Scottish and Southern. And coming back and saying, actually, we want to do things a bit differently, and this is what we want to do. And there was a few people that raised their eyebrows quite high and were like, really? We said, look, okay, I'll take a call centre of 1,000 people doing various activities, apply not all of the principles, actually, it's just some of the principles, and we'll see what happens. So I did that, and we saw a 25% shift in productivity. Customer satisfaction scores went up massively. We started seeing the retention of customers impacted because of that, and essentially was able to track the interactions that we made more from a cultural psychology perspective right the way through to the hardline money. So the CFO was, wow, if you can do that with that, off you go for the rest of the organisation.
If we look at maybe some of your key sort of measurement of your customer experience. Can you talk about at all how you benchmark yourself against maybe some of like the more traditional telcos, so whether it's through NPS or customer satisfaction? Do you know how you measure up against your peers?
So we use Net Promoter Scoring. We find it a good high-level measure of what's going on with the customers and the general sentiment. It doesn't give you action as to what you want to achieve out of it, but it gives you a sentiment driver. And I believe industry average for telcos is around the sort of 0 to 10% roughly. I know Virgin Media I was at a conference with them last year, and they were boasting about how they'd increased theirs from I think it was 10% to 12%, and it was worth I think 3 million for them in additional revenues, and they were therefore putting a lot more money into the customer experience. So when I came into Truphone, we started measuring what we were scoring. We were about 10-15%, and our Net Promoter Score is running at around, for the last 3 months, about 60% now. And actually this month, to date, it's actually about 70%, which is up there with the Disneys, the Apples of the world. So they're some of the highest Net Promoter Scores.
Okay. Adrian, interested to get your thoughts on Truphone and whether what you think, whether that could be kind of applied to the more traditional telco. Whether obviously they focus more on the business side, but into the retail arena. Do you see some things that they're doing that really should be being applied in more traditional telcos?
Well, I certainly think this whole idea of becoming much more agile, shortening those response times is absolutely crucial. As we move into an environment where the boundaries between technology, media, telecoms are all blurring, it's some of those larger established telcos that have got to work a little bit harder and shift the organisational mindset. And part of the issue there, I think, is very much that you're seeing quite a lot of paradoxes in the industry. You've got to focus on customer experience, but as we've seen in some of the surveys we've done at EY, network quality is still really important. And actually in the smartphone world, you actually have a higher proportion of dropped calls on smartphones compared to regular feature phones, which maybe you wouldn't expect. But at the same time, you've got this challenge whereby people want simplicity, but they also want choice. And how do you serve those two mindsets effectively? And I think, we're in this more complex environment, and a lot of the larger players, established players, need to adapt. You could also look at it from the point of view of the bundle market, the importance of upselling and cross-selling. In a lot of big players, still you've got that silo mentality even between the fixed and mobile parts of the business. And now you're starting to see some innovation at the sort of organisational level, but that's really got to accelerate and continue.
I mean, is it realistic? I mean, Rodney, for example, they talked about bringing a customer a phone off the plane. Some of that stuff, it's just not feasible, is it, for like a Vodafone or whoever it is to be able to do that?
It's going to be very challenging, right? I mean, if you're a multi-market operator with networks in each market, those different countries are run very differently. They may not be, answerable in the same way according to certain metrics, for example. That's certainly going to be a challenge. Scale certainly is an advantage in some respects, but it breeds a whole raft of new challenges in others.
Peter, I think again, you guys, as you talked about, you sort of come not from a traditional telco background. You kind of moved in from the sort of more digital space. What is your view of the telco market? And where it comes from compared to where some of the other sort of more traditional kind of online retailers are? Where do you see that it's sitting, and maybe some of the sort of the key challenges that I need to address?
I think some of the key challenges are, as I outlined in the presentation, I believe, the retail aspect is something that the telco can learn a lot from. They haven't got that part right. I think every time, we go into, a key telco store, you have the frustration of trying to sort of identify who the right person is to speak to, what the packages you really want, getting information, which is can be very frustrating, and the amount of people who literally turn away that could be obviously good customers is quite significant. So being able to not only deal with the online piece, and enable mobile and all that sort of thing. that's one thing, but I think also being able to integrate with the store itself and be able to do that fulfillment in the store is something that's very important for the telco. And we're seeing that in the retail, the retail telco market more and more. EE are doing this at the moment. E Plus are already trialing a solution, a POS solution that we have. And we're seeing more and more of that interest sort of coming in from the telcos. That's one thing. And I think some of the things we've talked about already, the downward pressure that's coming on telcos right now to look at other ways of generating revenue and increasing customer loyalty and retention and so on, really does demand a sort of an omni-channel approach. And what we mean by an omni-channel approach is that every touch point in that journey is actually covered. So, it's difficult, it's easy to say, and I spent 15, 20 minutes talking about this. It's very easy to say, but it's difficult to do because there are operational inhibitors in telcos. We know this. And so therefore, to be able to just say this and walk away is probably not the right thing. However, we have to look at all these data silos that telcos have, and how do you manage the information that comes from the mobile, the online piece, the POS, and so on and so forth. These are all separated into different silos of information, and that is a challenge for telcos, and it's not an easy one to just, you can't just gloss over it, so we appreciate that. But more and more now we're seeing that there is a move towards this omni-channel environment. Everyone talks about it in telco. There is a recognition that it needs to happen. And the main thing I think is now, as telcos are moving much more into a digital market play, for obvious reasons, we're seeing the ICT play becoming more and more prevalent as well. So they're enhancing the ICT services, just to move away from standard voice and data, offering things like security services and VMware and all sorts of things like that. This is going to increase more and more as well. And I think finally, the telcos are moving into this sort of the lead, if you like, into the digital play because they're now looking at entertainment services and all these sorts of things, which I think are going to grow more and more in the future.
Conrad, I'll come to you on that. I was quite interested in one of your slides, which was talking about the increasing number of channels of engagement that telcos have to deal with. They're increasing in number, in total number, if the actual interaction between each one is actually kind of decreasing to a certain degree. Where do you see sort of telcos really kind of needing to focus there to ensure that that's right? I mean, obviously there's the technology and the platform thing, but I mean, we talk about sort of cultural change need to go through. What are some of the other kind of bits and pieces that you think they need to focus on there?
I mean, I think I'd agree with Rodney in terms of the points around the fact that, yes, cultural change is the catalyst. I think in terms of our engagement with telcos, their problem is scale. That's the problem. It's how do you cope with this volume of interactions? Because in the voice world, it has been controllable, although it's real time, and you get the shift between asynchronous and synchronous communication. For me, it's absolutely about how they deal with scale, and that's the biggest challenge for them today.
Who'd like to ask? We've got the panel here. Who'd like to ask a question? And any of the guys about their presentation or their what have you? Yeah. Have we got a mic, or are we just? No, we're just asking out. Okay.
Just to follow on from that scaling point, how do you think, as an industry, we need to respond in terms of global scales, where we've got cultural maturity, market, regulatory differences? Because there are relatively few independent telcos anymore. Everyone's part of the group, and there's a dynamic there that's mostly political. Clearly, there are lessons that can be learned. How do you see the internal response capabilities of telecoms companies developing in the light of global best practice, etc., etc.? I'm kind of asking that question because I think everyone can have a go at it.
Thanks.
I think personally, you see that political perspective with the larger groups. And typically the opcos do exactly the opposite of what the group does, because nobody wants their empire to be swallowed up by the group. And that's where we get a lot of this differentiation. I think once you see organisations like Truphone setting the bar very high in terms of how they're approaching this new digital challenge, then hopefully we'll start to see people adopting that as a best practice across the piece.
From my perspective, it's a challenge. I mean, Adrian touched on, if you're a Vodafone customer, trying to link up between the various countries can be an operational issue. We've built global. Everything about us is global. The teams are orchestrated globally. I mean, my responsibility is to look over a global service team. I've got operations in 10 different countries around the world. But still, in each individual country, you still have a management challenge where you've got this local view that needs to happen and allow you to operate effectively, but you need to be considerate of the global community that you exist within. It becomes exceptionally obvious when we start working with customers that are global. So we have some customers that have a presence in, say, 5 of our 8 countries. So they want one account manager that's looking after 5 different countries, and the billing is a big challenge as well, and we've got some pretty cool technology that sits behind our systems to allow us to do some groundbreaking things from a billing perspective. But all of these questions start becoming when a customer says, well, how are you going to manage me across these 5 different countries, 4 different continents, maybe, and they want this seamless experience that's the same around the globe. At that point, it becomes very operationally clear in each country, we're a global team and we've got to work together here.
Do you maintain different KPIs in each territory so that you don't have comparability, but you do have specificity and cultural sensitivity?
No.
Or do you prioritise global comparability?
Global comparability is our driver. So everyone has similar objectives, targets. It's a global effort that needs to happen to pull together. If they were different in different markets, I think we'd start seeing divergence across our various countries. So it does need this central coordination and alignment piece to make it work effectively.
Adrian, we're gonna.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of issues there. It really does come back to this whole idea or notion of how you take advantage of scale. And if we look at some of the biggest telcos, we've had shifts in organisation structure historically. We've moved from fixed and mobile divisions to consumer enterprise. But even now, those delineations are becoming a little bit unclear in a BYOD environment where you've got consumerisation of the enterprise, where you've got SME, which is a historically underserved segment. In fact, it could be the very big growth areas, international SMEs that have very distinct needs across different geographies. And then that becomes a real challenge, especially for larger telcos, to adapt to that environment. Or if we think about the world of machine to machine, where actually operators may be playing more of a wholesale role within the value chain. And so these value chains are more B2B to B to C. And again, how do organisations adapt to capture those kind of opportunities? It's a really big question. And, we're seeing the creation of digital services, digital business units. And again, it may be about sort of incorporating a capability that as a telco you've acquired through an acquisition in a particular geography and cascading that globally, for example. But it's certainly a huge challenge.
We've got a couple of examples in the commerce world on that. Brightpoint, that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, are a logistics provider, actually. So they actually move cell phones effectively all around the world. And one of the things they wanted to do was actually host websites for customers, to sell to their customers effectively. So you may have a small, for example, MVNO like Teliasnera in Denmark that provide phones and devices and so on and so forth and services to their end user customers and business customers. So it could be B2B2B or B2B2C. And this is what they do. And the reason they're able to do it is because they have a centralized product catalog, and they're able to then disseminate that to lots of different businesses. The result being that they can actually appear as independent businesses in their own right, but all actually managed through a central system, which is hosted in this case by Brightpoint. It's now Ingram Micro, by the way. It's not Brightpoint anymore. Now this is kind of an interesting concept because it's not just about pricing and product. It's also about tax regulations. It's also about cultural things as well. And if I just flip to another example, is H&M, 42 sites. Now, if you're then trying to sell your brand across 42 sites, one thing you have to consider then is the implications from a cultural perspective. You know, you can't expose the same thing on a website in Saudi Arabia as you can, for example, in Sweden, without going into too much detail. But you get the point. So therefore, you know, you have to, from a commerce point of view, you have to consider all these different elements. You have to consider VAT. You have to consider in the pricing. You know, you have to consider culture. So there's a lot of things from a commerce point of view that you need to take on board when you're looking at globalization. I think that's really important.
Adrian picked out, Rodney, I think it was in his broadband customer survey, kind of 6 distinct groups of customer. Is something like that something that you would, you guys do? How do you, when you talk about sort of the personalisation, do you break them down into specific groups of types of customers, or how does that work specifically at that level?
We don't do something, it's not exactly the same. There are segments that we use inside our organisation about how we address market our customers, and generally it's around size of customer, because it's more businesses that we're dealing with. So yes, there is a little bit of finessing around what should we do for these, how do we set ourselves up, and how do we interact with these companies versus the smaller companies. You know, the SMEs are a big marketplace, and actually global SMEs are an interesting set of organisations to work with. So there are different requirements for each. Now, we haven't done surveys to go, okay, these ones prefer this versus this. The way that we've set it up is what are the needs of that customer and how do we serve it best. And that's the way we've come at this.
And are we talking tens of different groupings like that, or small?
About four.
About four groups.
Four groups,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions for the panel? Yeah.
Question for Igor. You spoke of personalized and differentiated experiences. Do you see net neutrality limiting what operators can do in this space?
I mean, that's a really big question. I'm not really sure I can call it, one way or the other on that score, but certainly that's a kind of overarching theme here that's sort of informing, what is the ability for an operator to provide a very differentiated service. The real question there is that going to impact the next customer who may not be paying quite as much for a certain service? And I think there, we're starting to see that this argument, net neutrality, it's been around for a while, and it is kind of shifting in slightly new directions. I mean, if you look at the way that the EU manages the whole issue, they center the argument more around sort of traffic shaping, for example. But what this actually will translate into in terms of an ability to provide a whole range of differentiated services, I guess there is, an element of caution on that score. And there has to be. And there are two, very radically opposed world views on that. I mean, I personally think it's very interesting if you look at, for example, the mobile data experience, and, we've done a big survey on that. If something goes wrong, whose responsibility is that? I mean, we were just talking about that during the coffee break. But, if something's not working on your phone, it's a mobile data service, it could be an OTT service, you might have a number to ring up. It might be the operator's number. You might not feel comfortable emailing an app developer, for example. So just understanding what roles these different entities occupy, given the fact that they all share customer ownership to some regard. For me, that's very interesting. But bringing it back to your original point about net neutrality, it may be that some of the hard and fast rules that we saw in the States, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe that will become more malleable over time. But are we going to see a complete pendulum shift from all bytes are created equally to the other end of the spectrum? Probably not.
Back at you, what's your own view?
I think it conflicts with the entire ability to provide this differentiated experience. I'm a strong believer in allowing flexibility operators to provide different levels of service. I mean, you have a segment of customers who don't want to spend as much on telco services. So by all means, I mean, they can still get on the bandwagon, but pay less. And there are levels of service, right? It doesn't necessarily have to do with
price. It could be for a particular OTT provider, a business-to-business relationship which the OTT or application service provider has with the operator. For all subscribers who choose to avail of that service, then they want A-class, premium, gold service, whatever it is. And I think that flexibility should be left open.
Okay. Rodney, have you got a view on that?
Not really. No. No, actually, I won't answer that one.
No. Okay.
Sorry.
But I mean, Adrian, we were talking this at a Congress about the idea around sort of sponsored data, for example, that AT&T have rolled out, being an example of that, and net neutrality was brought up as one of obviously the key problems with that. And certainly who we talked to, I think we said obviously with the status that the Netherlands have taken, for example, it's a non-starter. So, if that was those sorts of practices that are in the Netherlands were to expand through the rest of Europe, then I think there certainly would be issues with that. But it's certainly an interesting point. Ron, I'll come back to you again. You kind of glossed over it a little bit in your presentation, but you talked about there's a lot more we'd like to do with personalisation, and you talked about some of that sort of the data that you can look at, and you gave your own example. So if I could push you a little bit on that, and what would you really like to do with all that data? With the personalisation, how sort of granular would you like to go, and what would you like to be able to offer in the future?
So let me just expand this one with a story. So recently we onboarded a VIP, a friend of an investor of ours, and we wanted to make sure that their experience was what we offer, nothing short of fantastic. And so we delivered the handset, and everything worked well. What we wanted to make sure that was that he had a good service from there, and he was about to go travelling around the world, and things happen when you travel sometimes, and we just wanted to make sure that he was looked after well, and that none of these hiccups happened. So he was based in LA. We delivered the handset on a Friday, and on the Saturday he was travelling to China. So we were able to just check in over this period of time, and he landed in China. We saw him arrive there. Then he went to Japan. Then he went to Australia. Then he went to Hong Kong. Then he went to Russia. Then he went to the UK, and then he went back to LA. And we're able to track somebody and their usage around the world. There's a lot of data, and it's very specific data, and quite how you use that with a customer. Because our service delivery manager had an appointment with him a week later just to check in, did everything go okay? And pretty much the service delivery manager could go in there and go, I see you went to China and then you went to Japan, and that could really freak someone out. So you need to be careful with the privacy around this data, but you want to make sure that the customer experience was faultless. I mean, if he disappeared off our network for 2 days, we'd want to know. I mean, something happened in between, and we want to know where he was and what we need to fix. Now we can start doing this on a more grander scale, and I think through using things like big data, you can look for habits of people and where they're using the phone in a particular fashion, and then something changes. There'll be a reason for that change, and in some cases it could be a cry for help, and somebody needs assistance. Now, if we can figure that out and interact proactively rather than reactively at that time to put things right, that starts becoming a fantastic customer experience. So that's what we want. That's where I would like to get it to, and I think there's a bit of work to look at how you scale that from. I mean, it's very easy to do from a one-to-one basis, but a broader level that becomes quite a challenge.
Conrad, you got any sort of views on that side of things? I mean, you again mentioned sort of analytics. I know in your piece about how far sort of telcos should go with sort of looking at granular sort of data. So, what was your sort of view there?
I think moving down that road to personalisation, of course, the obvious thing is to start following your customers on platforms like Twitter, trying to work out what their behaviour is to add to the data that you've got in terms of their location and the services they're using. I think the challenge comes back then, okay, that's even more data. How do you then utilise that in terms of building a meaningful relationship? Because there's been a big was a big push towards marketing in terms of listening to what customers were saying on some of these digital channels, and listening in silent, observe-only mode, and then trying to engage with them in a meaningful conversation. And we've seen it with some of the retailers. So, for example, Tesco's. If you post a comment to say, I'm waiting at home and my Waitrose delivery is late, they will tweet you and say, okay, we're sorry to hear about that. And then a week later they'll say, did you get your shopping? And then 2 weeks later they'll say, listen, if it didn't work out, www.tesco.com. So I think there's an opportunity to do that, but it's again, what do you do with that data? And especially if you can't automate it and you need manual intervention, you've got the scale problem again.
Yeah, we have two questions. One at the back first, Hugh. And sorry, that was you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you've said a lot about customer experience and personalisation. I'm a big fan of Apple, and I really like this big bit of technology that they're using at the moment. So basically, I can just put my phone in there, and I can buy something on iTunes. One of the problems I have with my mobile phone, do online shopping, for example, is the whole process of having to register with various service providers and online shopping sites and actually go through the whole process of just buying it. And it kind of puts me off from, using new services because I can't bother to go through the whole registration process. Could mobile operators take more of a responsibility in registering customers towards new services? For example, could they do something with Apple and use that fingerprint technology to enable me to use the services?
Who would like to take that one? Peter, that might be a good one for you to start off on.
I think the answer is probably yes, they could. I think what you've just explained there, I think we all share that sort of frustration. So I can't speak for the mobile operators, but yeah, I think certainly that would be a way forward, definitely. Yeah.
I think ID and V, or verification, has always been a big challenge for the telcos and for the banks, but you're starting to see people use things like now you're logged in with Facebook already, or you're logged in through one of the digital channels, so we see you as verified. We see it with web chat as well, people being in a portal, so they're already secure, and then they're having a dialogue around kind of maybe procurement exercise or buying something. But it is a big issue because, of course, you've got the fraud element to consider, and knowing your customer, the KYC question.
Digital identity is becoming, really big in the telecom sector now. I mean, the GSMA's got a new initiative on it. I think in the UK, from next year, your mobile phone number will be a bank account identifier. So there's certainly an opportunity there, and there seem to be sort of other forces that are maybe helping that along. So certainly an area where we could expect to see a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's kind of two things there. I mean, there's the security trade-off versus the ease of use, and then there's the whole idea about telcos already kind of think Apple has far too much, control over what they can do. So whether they'd be willing to go that far, it's another point. But
That's an example of where the mobile operators put themselves first ahead of the customers'
Sure.
experience.
yeah, no, I'd agree. Okay. Hugh had another question here.
And just on that, Google do a lot of heavy lifting, in fact, a surprising amount, which changes the CEM base level that customers expect in terms of operation. Of course, Google do it in such a way that it differentiates what they offer by the Chrome browser or wherever. The question I want to ask is relating to fraud from two perspectives. The first is that looking at the ability to automate algorithmically, there's a lot of what we're looking at in the personalization domain, which is effectively mirroring the sorts of algorithms that are being used in the fraud domain, the AI algorithms for tracking anomalous behaviors, doing logins, all this sort of thing. So the first is on the positive side. What can we do with what we already have in place to manage fraud, ideally, that can be used in the CEM personalization, customization space? And the second is looking at the broader sort of social aspects of CEM. Are there any particular gruesome horror stories, because they're always fun, but are there any new areas that are cropping up that are ripe for fraud that we haven't really got a handle on yet?
I mean, so I can answer the first part. Second part, probably not. First part, you're right. There's a lot that we can be doing from data analysis to see odd behaviours or non-normal behavioural patterns. Now, a lot of that you can just see through spend, and see sudden hikes and things and spend. So we've got some tools in place that monitor things like that. So, but I'm sure there's a lot more that we can do around the science. I mean, Wonga is a fantastic example of using social networks and other information available for that person or company on the web and to look at their trustworthiness. So I think there's some really intriguing lessons that will start coming out from the way that people are using that data. And I think it will become more and more critical, and your profiles that you're keeping out there are actually become valuable to you as well as other people in understanding you as a character. So I think there's a lot more work to be completed in that space.
I was going to say, I think personally, the telco market, I think, is quite advanced in some ways. I mean, when I compare it to sort of using my credit card, my bank wants to know all the time and sending me text messages. What are you doing? Have you still got your card? That kind of stuff. So there is, I think the telco market is quite advanced in terms of being able to recognise people who are in an HLR or a VLR or whatever, and the spend pattern piece is obviously important. But I don't think it's as bad as perhaps some markets out there in terms of being exploitable from a fraud perspective.
Okay, yeah.
Just one final question. Just it's quite clear that network and clarity of bundles and offers is still coming through as impacting customer experience and net promoter. But a lot of you talk about omnichannel. Do you see anyone at the moment in the European marketplace from a telco being fixed on mobile that's leading from an omnichannel perspective across from the channel to the chat to social to into the store, etc. That's really driven that space.
Certainly from my perspective, I don't see anyone doing the whole end-to-end piece. No, I think it's aspirational to do the point-of-sale integration part. If I'm honest, I think it's really the technology that's out there that can enable that, coupled with the desire for the operator to be able to sort of rejig some of their operational processes and get the data into one place and all this kind of thing that we've talked about. Who does it well? There are some good examples of multi-channel solutions out there. 3 do it pretty well. 3 have been very sort of customer focused. They're always sort of focused on acquisition, obviously. But one of the things they do very well is guided selling. They're able to do that pretty well. And they also have enabled mobile now. Call center's the next, but in-store is a little bit further down the road. Ones that are probably coming up on the rails, I would say, is EE. Because their whole mandate is about digital transformation. So they're looking at driving content into the system and not just being a voice or data player. They want to be a full digital provider. And so they are looking very seriously now at not just that, but also the store side and integration into the store to fulfill the order there. And they, I think, will be probably the first example of a true, I would say, omni-channel player, in my opinion.
And that's been driven by who? That's been driven by the head of care or head of marketing driving that?
It's a combination really. It's come from, I mean, the project itself is a digital transformation project, but there's also a strong customer care element in there as well. So it's rolled in a lot of different facets of the business. But of course the retail side is now come up very, very strongly. So the retail point is actually now working with the digital side to actually pull this all together into one sort of omni-channel unit. So I would say, that's probably, or maybe E+ as well as another one. Those 2 across Europe.
Anyone else want to throw any names out there?
I think on our side, certainly our customer B&U seem to be being quite aggressive and being quite successful. I think, if I'm honest, it is the smaller guys who've been able to start with a kind of clean sheet of paper, a greenfield. They've been much more able to exploit the opportunity. The larger guys, I think, have struggled.
That's what I'm trying to understand is what is it enabling to do it?
Yeah.
Greenfield enabled to build that capability.
I mean,
it's easier than in
Yeah.
I mean, B&U's
Absolutely.
B&U's vision is that you ultimately will be able to start in one channel, move to another channel, break off that conversation, be asynchronous, and without any real impact in terms of the relationship and the conversation.
Actually, and to that point as well, the greenfield situation, we're seeing a lot now in the Far East, in emerging countries, where a lot of the old legacy is actually sort of it's jumping from that to the new stuff. There's nothing in between. So like we're going to 2G, 3G, and so on. It's not happening so much in the Far East. It particularly, and in Latin America as well. So we're seeing them adopting these new technologies and this new approach to omni-channel more and more. So that's an interesting one to watch. Yeah.
Just on that point, on the B&U point, I think we've got some data sheets around there. There's some data in there around what we've been able to help them with.
Adrian, did you want to? Are you allowed to throw out any names?
I
or-
can't really throw out
Can't-
any names. I mean, you know, all I would say is that, you know, I mean, you know, I sort of track what goes on in the M&A environment, and certainly I'd go with that broader point about the lack of legacy, the clean sheet of paper, and you know, certainly in terms of, you know, adjacent market acquisitions or building store footprints, seeing a lot of players, you know, for example, in the Far East, in Eastern Europe, you know, making strides on that score. How that translates into the omnichannel, for example, I'm probably not best placed to comment, but interesting seeing how different regions are moving at different rates.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of the seminar today. I'd just like to thank all of our 4 speakers for their time and their presentations, and sticking to time as well, which is very luxury for me. So thank you very much, guys. It's been